When you stop to think about it, self-control impacts on nearly every part of our lives. Eating the right food, getting enough exercise, avoiding drugs and alcohol, studying more, working harder, spending less. They're all impacted by self-control. And then when you go on to think about it, the converse is also true. Almost every problem that plagues modern society today is due to a lack of self-control. Things like addiction, overeating, crime, domestic violence, sexually transmitted diseases, prejudice, debt, unwanted pregnancy, educational failure, underperformance at work, lack of savings, failure to exercise. All of those things are impacted by a lack of self-control. They all have, to some degree, failure of self-control in them. This concept of self-control, of being able to choose the important over the urgent and to find some discipline in our lives is so central to our human experience that God shows us throughout the Bible the negative consequences of the lack of self-control. In the passage that we read earlier from Exodus chapter 16, God's people are already showing a lack of control right at the beginning of the passage, because we find them whining and grumbling and moaning about the situation that they find themselves in. Have a look at verses 2 and 3. There too, the whole community of Israel complained about Moses and Aaron. If only the Lord had killed us back in Egypt, they moaned. There we sat around pots filled with meat and ate all the bread we wanted. But now you've brought us into this wilderness to starve us all to death. What a load of whingers. But actually, we need to show them some grace, don't we? They find themselves in a very difficult time. Life was hard in Egypt, but it appears that life in the desert, in the wilderness, seems even worse than that. They find themselves in uncharted territory with no end in sight. They can't see light at the end of the tunnel. They find themselves in harsh surroundings. And so is it not natural that they perhaps find difficulty in placing their total trust and obedience in God? And so they come up with their own solution. Clearly, the solution to this problem, to this difficult time, is simply to go back to where they had come from. To return to normal, if you like. To return to what they were used to. Yes, life in Egypt might have been hard, but it certainly seems better than this. Have you ever felt like that? Maybe even in the past few weeks, the past few months, you felt that way. But the news, the good news of this passage this morning is that our God is a gracious God. Although their requests came to him in complaining and moaning and whining, God graciously hears their cries and promises to provide for his people, and to provide not just a little, not just enough, but to provide abundantly. In verse 4, the Lord said to Moses, "Look, I'm going to rain down food from heaven for you. Each day the people can go out and pick up as much food as they need for that day. I will test them in this to see whether or not they will follow my instructions." And then a little bit later in verse 12 he says, "I've heard the Israelites' complaints. Now tell them, in the evening you will have meat to eat, and in the morning you will have all the bread you want. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God." God says, I've heard your complaints, I've heard your moaning, I've heard your needs, and I'm going to give you not just some food, not just sufficient food, but food is going to rain down from heaven. You are going to have all the meat and the bread that you have ever wanted. God promises to feed his people until they're satisfied, until they're sated. What infinite patience he shows. This was far more than they deserved as they whinged and moaned, even as God was leading them. But that's who our God is. And so God makes good on his promise. In verses 13 to 15 we read, "That evening vast numbers of quail flew in and covered the camp, and the next morning the area around the camp was wet with dew. When the dew evaporated, a flaky substance as fine as frost blanketed the ground. The Israelites were puzzled when they saw it. 'What is it?' they asked each other. They had no idea what it was. And Moses told them, 'It is the food the Lord has given to you to eat.'" God had provided for them in their infinite patience. But God's provision came with specific instructions. Each day, his people were told they were to go out and to gather the bread. And when they did so, they were only to gather as much as they needed for that day and no more. Except on the sixth day, when they would gather twice as much so that they could observe the rest day, to observe the Sabbath on the seventh day. Now this was a test. That word that we translate in our translation as instructions is the Hebrew word Torah, and it means God's law. Here God is testing his people. Would they keep his law? Would they show faith in his promises? In verse 19, Moses says, "Do not keep any of it until morning." Will you test the promise that God has for you? No hoarding, no holding on to God's provision. His people would need to learn to trust him for their tomorrow as much as for their today. God asks them to believe that he will continue to provide for them what he has promised each day, but just a day at a time. Every day he tests their trust in him. Will you trust me today? Will you trust me today? Will you trust me day by day, week by week, month by month, year by year? Will you trust me in everything that you need? Now, this is not a test like an exam or a quiz. God isn't testing Israel, isn't testing his people to see if he can get them to fail if they don't live up to it. What he's doing is testing them for their benefit. If they pass this test of trusting and obeying him, then they will learn what it is like to obey God and what he requires of them. As we know from the passage that we read, some of them chose not to trust God and chose not to obey him and to follow his specific instructions. And in that we discover for ourselves what the alternative to our trusting and obeying God is. In verse 20 it says, "But some of them didn't listen and kept some of it until morning, but by then it was full of maggots and had a terrible smell. Moses was very angry with them." And then some of them decided to break the Sabbath as well. In verse 27, "Some of the people went out anyway on the seventh day, but they found no food." The alternative, the consequence, if you like, to deciding not to trust and obey God and to try to do things in their own strength was to find rot, was to find destruction, was to find emptiness. This all comes from a lack of self-control, a lack of discipline in following the instructions that God had given them, trying to gather more than they really needed. If only they had chosen self-control. If only they had chosen to obey God, they would have been deepening their relationship with him. They would have learned more about the generous, faithful nature of the covenantal God who leads them. I have no doubt that the last 5 months has been a testing time. Maybe this morning as you come to worship, as you listen to this message, you feel that God doesn't care what has been happening to you in lockdown. Maybe on occasion you've grumbled at him as the Israelites did. I know that I have. Certainly the pandemic has felt like a desert place, has felt like a wilderness at times. And maybe we've pined for the flesh pots of what life was like before lockdown. But maybe this morning, as we reflect on the story of the Israelites in the desert, we can come to see lockdown as a gift of God to us. Maybe we can use our experiences to see how God has much more in store for us than we could ever imagine. Maybe our experience can help us see that he knows just what we need, even in the middle of a world crisis, even in the middle of lockdown. Maybe God is using this time to bring us to a place where we can say, we trust the Lord to do what is best. Can you say that this morning? We trust the Lord to do what is best. That's the secret to self-control. Will we pursue what is important to God, or will we be drawn to what we think is best, or what society tells us to focus on? As we continue to come out of lockdown, do we want to go back to what seems best to us? Do we want to return to the meat pots and the bread of Egypt? Or will we trust God for the new things that he is already doing and that he has in store for us? Things so new that, like the Israelites, we might exclaim, what is it? What is it that God is doing amongst us? To lean into the new normal and to let go of the past, both individually and corporately, requires self-control. It requires discipline. It requires making a moment-by-moment choice to trust God. So will you, with me, make that choice this morning? You don't have to do it alone. Remember that self-control is a fruit of the Spirit. Walk closely with him. Let him guide you. Let him empower you. Simply lean into him in quietness and trust. Make trust in God the bedrock on which you make your everyday decisions as he leads us into the new normal. God bless you.
So will you on board the find rest, my soul, in Christ alone. Yeah. Know His power in quietness and trust. When the oceans rise and thunders roll, I will soar with you.